Hello, it's Lord Slar here, and today we are, for the first time in a while, pitting two Doctor Who stories against each other in a versus match. In this series, I take two episodes of A Strong Link and compare them in various categories to see which is the superior story. This time we're taking a look at Resurrection and Revelation of the Daleks. The two stories are linked together by the fact they're both written by Eric Saward, and they're Saward's only Dalek stories. At this point in Classic Who, very few writers other than Terry Nation himself had written Dalek stories, with only David Whittaker and Louis Marks having done so before Saward. Like Whittaker before him, Saward has his own spin on the Daleks unique from Nation. Whereas Whittaker tended to focus on the mentality of the Daleks in his stories, Saward was more keen to emphasise their brutal side, even more so than Terry Nation's darkest stories. This does lend a very scary edge to the Daleks, seeing the lengths they and Davros are willing to go. But which of these two stories was better? Let's take a look. The Doctor. In Season 21, I feel that Davison is finally finding his feet as the Doctor, coming across as a much more interesting and conflicted character than in previous seasons. This is the case here, as Davison is given some good material and works with it. You can almost see the youthful hope and optimism which originally defined his Doctor melt away in this story, as events slowly slip beyond his control, driving him to the point where he contemplates executing Davros in cold blood. It's a very important moment for Davison's Doctor's character arc, which I explained in my Caves of Androzani video, which I'll link in the description for you. His confrontation with Davros is a great one, and his reaction to Tegan's exit is very understated and a very emotional moment, as he clearly struggles to fully digest all the horrible things that have happened in this story. Definitely one of Davison's best TV outings. The Doctor's appearance in Revelation of the Daleks is a bit mixed. On the one hand, Colin Baker puts in one of his best TV performances, and the dialogue is absolutely sparkling, especially in his confrontation with Davros. In episode 2, Baker gets a lot to do and he puts in a dominating performance. However, the fact that he spends half the story not even participating is the problem. For the entirety of episode 1, he's walking from the countryside to Tranquil Repose, where the bulk of the plot is taking place. He and Perry barely get anything to do, and anything of note for the whole of it, and as a result they feel like spare parts in a story that doesn't really need them, at least for half of it. These sequences really serve to slow the flow of the story down, and are definitely a problem that Resurrection doesn't have. Resurrection may have been one of Davison's best outings as the Doctor, but he unfortunately doesn't quite have the gravitas that a really commanding Colin Baker performance has. For once on TV, Baker is given some excellent material to work with, at least in part 2, which makes up for his pseudo-absence in part 1. Just rewatch his confrontation with Davros, and it's very hard to argue that Revelation shouldn't win this category. Companions. Tegan and Turlough are the companions in Resurrection of the Daleks, and they are two that I wouldn't particularly say are my favourites. Turlough, again, doesn't really get a lot to do. This has become pretty common by this stage, as after the story Enlightenment, his character development ground to a halt, and he lost anything interesting about him. Tegan, on the other hand, has a great story here. Through her, the audience gets to see so much of the senseless brutality of the Daleks, and it really hits home just how horrible they are. This is the case so much so, that she has a very sad exit as she runs off almost in tears at the end of the story just because of how much has been lost for nothing. Again, it's a very important part in the Fifth Doctor's character arc. Perry suffers from the exact same issue as the Doctor does in terms of being a complete spare part that slows down the flow of the story in episode 1. Like the Doctor, however, she does get a bit more time to shine in episode 2. I really like the part of the episode she spends with the DJ. It gives Perry somebody nice and not lecherous to talk to for once, and for me it was a lovely little character moment for her. Although beyond that, her involvement in episode 2 is pretty limited as well. Overall, I'd have to say Perry isn't used that well in this story, but given the sheer amount of side characters, that isn't really surprising. This category is an easy win for Resurrection. Yes, Turlough isn't used very well, but this is arguably Tegan's best outing as a companion. You really feel for her in this one. Perry, on the other hand, really doesn't get a whole lot to do. Davros and the Daleks. After a pretty mediocre appearance in Destiny of the Daleks, Davros returns, this time played by Terry Malloy. He instantly owns the role, managing to perfectly express Davros's manipulative, sadistic and fanatic side with equal skill. As I said earlier, his confrontation with Davison's Doctor is great, and he has an all-round solid performance, as he kickstarts the Dalek Civil War by betraying the Supreme Dalek by releasing the Mavellan virus. The Daleks very much needed their credibility restored after a laughably bad appearance in Destiny of the Daleks, where they were poorly written and abysmally directed. I think Eric Saward manages to do that perfectly here, by giving them such a nasty and brutal story. It does a lot to restore a villain's credibility by giving them an episode where the on-screen kill count is higher than the Terminator. I think it's important to highlight that this is a story where the Daleks are weak and desperate. They've been crippled by the Magellan virus and need a cure fast. As they're backed into a corner, they begin to rely on inferior species to help bulk out their numbers, even letting the likes of Lytton assist with Dalek strategy. Even going back to Davros shows desperation, as they were more than happy to exterminate him as an inferior in Genesis of the Daleks. Yet also in this story, they turn on both Davros and their auxiliary forces, even though they probably need both to survive. This, I think, is showing how dangerous the Dalek, and by extension fascist, mentality is. Because of their warped beliefs about being the superior beings, they are completely unpredictable. When backed into a corner, they'll do the most depraved things in order to survive, just to prove they're not inferior. Even though they need the auxiliary forces, they still turn on them just because they're different, and that contradicts the Dalek mentality of superiority to work with them. That's what makes the Daleks really scary, just how unhinged they are about their superiority. It leads them to commit all manner of atrocities, especially when they're backed into a corner. The Daleks really are frightening in this one. Davros is absolutely on fire in Revelation of the Daleks, and this is arguably his best TV appearance, aside from Genesis of the Daleks. Malloy had already established himself very well in Resurrection of the Daleks, but here he absolutely owns the role, and he's given much better material to boot. Throughout, Davros is scheming and manipulating many different people, which is exactly what makes a great Davros appearance. His confrontation with the Sixth Doctor is easily the best Dr. Davros meeting on TV outside of Genesis. He's probably the best part of this story and absolutely steals the show when he's on screen. We even get to see Davros have a bit of fun by tricking the Doctor into thinking he will die before regenerating again by erecting a fake gravestone with his face on it, laughing maniacally as the Doctor walks towards it. Excellent stuff. Unfortunately, the Daleks do not fare as well. Davros' new Imperial Daleks barely get any on-screen time or dialogue, and the appearance of the Renegade Daleks is extremely brief. They don't carry anywhere near as much of a threat that they did in Resurrection, as they barely get anything to do in this entire story. One great scene that stands out, however, is the scene where Natasha meets her father as he is encased in a Dalek incubator and being turned into a Dalek. It's such a horrifyingly intense scene as Stengos begs Natasha to kill him, while enthusiastically reciting Dalek mantra about being the supreme beings. It's probably up there with one of my favourite ever Doctor Who scenes, acted intensely and shot beautifully. Absolutely amazing from Graham Harper and the actors involved, not to mention Eric Saward himself. This is a very difficult category to judge. Resurrection absolutely wipes the floor with Revelation in terms of how the Daleks themselves are used on the one hand, but Davros is just such a brilliant joy to watch in Revelation. I think I'll have to give a slight edge to Revelation on this one, as even though the Daleks are great in Resurrection, they just aren't as interesting as Davros is on top form in Revelation. Side characters. Resurrection has a few fairly decent side characters. Not many of them get an awful lot of screen time before being violently killed by the Daleks, but they're good nonetheless. Saward, despite a few dodgy lines, is good at dialogue too. You really get a sense of who the characters are as people, most of whom are pretty ordinary but well-meaning. And this is all before they face becoming a part of the insane death toll of this story. This means that a lot of the deaths are actually impactful, and show just how indiscriminate the Daleks are with their fanatic murder. Special shout out to Commander Lytton as a side character who was great in this story and even got a return in Attack of the Cybermen. He's even getting his own comic book series soon, which does look like something I might check out. Revelation of the Daleks is absolutely overflowing with brilliant side characters. At this stage, Eric Saward had clearly been influenced by Robert Holmes, who had recently returned to write Doctor Who. Part of his style is to have double-act side characters who bounce off of each other. The most famous example of this is Jago and Lightfoot, who got their own spin-off series. Saward took this very much to heart, as almost every character in Revelation of the Daleks is a double act. You have Tarkus and Lilt, Orsini and Bostock, Kara and Virgil, Natasha and Grigory, and the Doctor and Perry, and even Jobel and Tassenbeaker could count as one. This allows for some absolutely sparkling dialogue, with every character having somebody to bounce off. In almost all cases, they manage to get an actor pairing with brilliant chemistry, making the flow of dialogue in almost every scene a joy to watch. It's really well written by Saward. Every single character bar Tassenbeaker is played absolutely brilliantly. This is clearly a script the actors had a lot of fun with. My particular favourites are William Gaunt as Orsini, Clive Swift as Jobel, and the pairing of Eleanor Bron as Kara and Hugh Walters as Vogel. I was also a big fan of the DJ, who was played by Alexei Sayle. I know many viewers find him a bit annoying, but I think he's absolutely brilliant at bringing a bit of levity to what is one of the darkest ever Doctor Who stories, while also lending a hand in creating what is a very surreal atmosphere. This category is a pretty conclusive win for Revelation of the Daleks. By no means are the side characters bad in Resurrection, but they're not even close to how fun and memorable all the duos in Revelation of the Daleks are. Plot. At its heart, Resurrection is a fairly simple story about the Daleks rescuing Davros after being annihilated by the Mobilum virus so that he can help them find a cure, only for both parties to betray each other, starting the Dalek Civil War, which defined the Dalek 80s stories. That'd all be well and good, if a little unspectacular, but Eric Saward overcomplicates things by adding the duplicate subplot. Basically, the Daleks have started cloning people, but with Dalek conditioning to help them do their dirty work, both as soldiers and agents in enemy territory. On top of their plan to rescue Davros to find a cure for the virus, they're also trying to take over the Earth using duplicates in strategic positions, as well as luring the Doctor to Earth using the Time Corridor, and then go through the Time Corridor to kidnap the Doctor and his companions, duplicate them, and send them to assassinate the High Council of Gallifrey, but none of this works because the duplicates are all too unstable and can shake off their conditioning, and do not see how this is getting a bit too overcomplicated yet. The subplot doesn't really add anything to the story, other than the reason for the Doctor to be lured there, but they could have just cut this plot entirely and have the Doctor land randomly as usual, and you wouldn't really lose much from the story. In fact, I think streamlining it would have really improved the flow of the story a lot. The story definitely slows down in episode 3, and this plot point is brought to the forefront in that period. It just wasn't interesting, and it was too convoluted and didn't go anywhere, so what was even the point? There are two sides to the plot in Revelation of the Daleks. In the first, it excels, in the other, it kind of drops the ball. Let's start off with what it does well, and that's the themes Revelation of the Daleks explores. The focal point of this story is our attitude towards death, which is a really grim but daring subject for a TV show billed at Saturday tea time to tackle. In the story, Tranquil Repose is a place where people with enough money are cryogenically frozen, so that when a cure is found for the illness they were suffering, they can go on living. However, Davros has taken over the place, and it's experimenting on dead bodies, and either turn them into Daleks or food for the famine-ravaged population of the galaxy. Nobody particularly cares about this either. Politicians are actively trying to block recovery of any bodies from the Repose for fear of having powerful rivals brought back to life, while the staff often joke and revel in their own self-importance despite all the grisly goings-on around them. Even though a lot of people want to take out Davros, most of it's purely for selfish reasons. Kara, for instance, wants to have greater control over the sale of protein derived from the corpses. The message Saward has here is that nobody actually gives a shit about you when you're dead. Immediate friends and family might, but to society at large, you're just one less mouth to feed and one less problem to solve, and it doesn't matter how important you are. Saward highlights that in a particular moment in the preparations for the funeral of the President's wife. The chief embalmer, Jobel, orders all staff to show a surface level of respectability once the President arrives, as if to show mock reverence, but in the meantime he constantly jokes about the fact that her corpse is decaying and bloating with a very cavalier attitude. In a society where life is cheap, death is even cheaper, and that's the very grim theme of this story. As good as the story is at exploring these themes, the plot does have one vital flaw. It has one of the most cumbersome plots from Doctor Who ever. As I said, there are a lot of side characters in this story, and they are great, but each one has some kind of plan and ulterior motive within the story. There are literally 4 different reasons people want to stop Davros. Developing all of this takes a lot of time and very strong pacing. It was extremely ambitious to try and fit this much content into 2 45-minute episodes. Unfortunately, Saward fails at doing this. The way all the plot threads are introduced at the beginning feels very clunky, and the viewer is bombarded with way too much information at the beginning of the story. Once everything is introduced, it runs fairly smoothly if still feeling a bit clunky. This is an episode that was too ambitious for its own good in terms of story content. It either needed a number of really strong rewrites, one element to be removed to give the rest more breathing room, or an extra episode added with a big rewrite to accommodate all of these threads. There certainly are enough great ideas to make another part work well, but ultimately I feel that just cutting down a little on what the story is trying to do would have been the best solution. In both cases, Saward really makes his plot suffer by having too many ideas in them, which are far too convoluted for their own good. Just stick with a few ideas and tell them well. Less would have been more in this case. However, I will be giving this category to Revelation, as all of its interesting ideas and brilliant moments really stand out and make it shine despite this issue. Resurrection is a fairly conventional Dalek story by comparison, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not as exciting. Production. Resurrection is directed by Matthew Robinson, who also did Attack of the Cybermen, and he does a pretty good job here. I particularly like the location work and the abandoned old warehouses of London. It really struck the tone for a very bleak story, which pervades the rest of the episodes. All the sets are well made, and overall this is a great looking and sounding Doctor Who story. Revelation of the Daleks looks and sounds beautiful. Graham Harper was brought back as director after his excellent tour de force in Caves of Androzani the previous season. Arguably, Harper did a better job here than he did on Androzani. The setting allows for really creative sets and sublime lighting. Every frame here really is a picture. He cultivates an extremely unsettling, surreal atmosphere that almost feels like some kind of crazy nightmare, a huge achievement given the budget he had to work with. Roger Lim also returns to compose after his great Caves of Androzani soundtrack, and this again fits in perfectly with the tone Harper was going for. I think the story deserves special credit for attempting some very ambitious special effects work, with flying Daleks and Davros. It doesn't look like much to modern eyes, but it was impressive for the time and the budget they had. Big shout out to the really disgusting makeup and prosthetics job done on the head of Arthur Stengos. It makes that scene absolutely horrifying. Again, this is a case where Resurrection does a good job, but Revelation does an absolutely superb job. It has to be said that Revelation, in terms of production and acting, has to be one of the best made Classic Who episodes, so it's no shame for Resurrection to lose here, but lose it does nonetheless. To conclude, this was a pretty comprehensive win for Revelation of the Daleks. However, Saward should be praised for turning out two quality Dalek scripts which restored their credibility as a horrifying threat. The production of both these stories too were very impressive for the time, and Revelation in particular really stands out for being a stylish Doctor Who story. Both stories share the same problem: Saward's habit of overcomplicating things a bit too much. There are too many subplots and motivations going on in both episodes, and it really does take away from the experience. He also made this mistake in Attack of the Cybermen, which arguably does it worst as it is just one big fanwank fest. That aside, these are two great Dalek stories, and Revelation in particular deserves more recognition as one of Doctor Who's greatest hits.